On February 4th, 1959, a British petroleum oil exploration team was conducting a survey flight over the Libyan Desert, 400 miles south of the Mediterranean coast, deep in one of the most inhospitable regions of the Sahara. The team was using light aircraft to map potential drilling sites in an area that had never been thoroughly explored. At approximately 1100 hours, the pilots spotted something impossible. There, in the middle of the desert, sitting on flat sand as if it had landed the day before, was an American bomber. The aircraft appeared intact. There was no visible damage. The wings were straight. The landing gear was retracted. The plane sat on its belly in the sand, but otherwise looked almost airworthy. The pilot circled the wreck several times, taking photographs and noting the position. When he returned to base and reported what he had found, no one believed him. There were no records of any American aircraft crashes in that part of the Sahara. The area was hundreds of miles from any known flight routes. How could an American bomber possibly be sitting in the desert 400 miles from the coast? But the photographs were undeniable. Something was out there. A ground expedition was organized to investigate. On February 9, 1959, the ground team reached the wreck. What they found was extraordinary. The aircraft was a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, serial number 4124301. The plane was in remarkable condition considering it had been sitting in the desert. The aluminum skin was intact, except where sand had abraded it. The tires had deflated, but were not destroyed. The cockpit windows were unbroken. The radio equipment appeared functional. Most incredibly, when mechanics examined the engines, they found that with fresh oil and fuel, the engines would probably run. The plane had not crashed. It had made a wheels-up landing on the flat desert sand and had remained essentially intact. Inside the bomber, the investigators found equipment, supplies, and personal effects, but no bodies. The crew had clearly survived the landing and abandoned the aircraft. But where had they gone? And what had happened to them? The investigators searched the bomber for identification. On the nose of the aircraft, painted in faded letters, was a name: Lady B. Good. A check of records revealed that the Lady B. Good had taken off from Solek Airfield in Libya on April 4, 1943, 16 years earlier, on a bombing mission to Naples, Italy. The aircraft and its 9-man crew had never returned. They had been listed as missing in action, presumed lost over the Mediterranean. The assumption had been that the bomber had been shot down over the sea or had crashed on the return journey. No one had imagined that the aircraft had flown 400 miles inland, deep into the Sahara Desert, before running out of fuel and making an emergency landing. The discovery of the Lady B. Good raised immediate questions. How had the bomber ended up so far south? Why had the crew abandoned a perfectly functional aircraft? And most importantly, what had happened to the 9 men aboard? To understand the story of the Lady B. Good, one must understand the context of the air war in the Mediterranean in 1943. The United States Army Air Forces had established bomber bases in Libya after Allied forces captured the region from the Germans and Italians in early 1943. These bases, including Solek Airfield near Benghazi, were used to launch bombing raids against Axis targets in Italy, Sicily, and southern Europe. The bombers were primarily B-24 Liberators, 4-engine heavy bombers capable of carrying substantial bomb loads over long distances. The missions were dangerous. Bombers faced anti-aircraft fire, fighter interception, mechanical failures, and navigation challenges. Many aircraft and crews were lost. The Lady B. Good and her crew were part of this air campaign, and their mission on April 4, 1943, was supposed to be routine. The Lady B. Good was assigned to the 514th Bombardment Squadron, 376th Bombardment Group, based at Solek Airfield. The aircraft had been delivered new to the squadron just days before the mission. The crew was experienced, but had not flown together extensively. The pilot was First Lieutenant William Hatton, aged 26, from New York. The co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Robert Toner, aged 24, from Massachusetts. The navigator was Second Lieutenant D.P. Hayes, aged 23, from Virginia. The bombardier was Second Lieutenant John Waravka, aged 24, from Ohio. The flight engineer was Technical Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, aged 30, from Pennsylvania. The radio operator was Technical Sergeant Robert Lamotte, aged 21, from Louisiana. The three gunners were Staff Sergeant Guy Shelley, aged 23, from Pennsylvania, Staff Sergeant Vernon Moore, aged 21, from Ohio, and Staff Sergeant Samuel Adams, aged 22, from Texas. 9 men, all in their 20s or early 30s, all volunteers who had enlisted to fight in the war. The mission briefing on the morning of April 4th called for a bombing raid on the harbor at Naples, Italy. 25 B-24 bombers from the 376th Bombardment Group would fly north across the Mediterranean, bomb the target, and return to Solok. The mission distance was approximately 1,400 miles round trip, well within the B-24's range. Weather was expected to be marginal with clouds and poor visibility. The bombers would fly in formation for mutual protection and navigation. The Lady Be Good, being brand new, was making its first combat mission. The crew was eager, but understandably nervous. This was what they had trained for. At 14:30 hours on April 4th, 1943, the 25 bombers began taking off from Solok Airfield. The Lady Be Good took off successfully and joined the formation heading north toward the Mediterranean and Italy. The mission did not go as planned. Weather over the Mediterranean was worse than forecast. Heavy clouds and sandstorms reduced visibility to near zero. The bomber formation struggled to maintain cohesion. Several aircraft turned back to base due to mechanical problems or inability to find the formation in the clouds. By the time the formation reached Naples, only a handful of bombers remained together. The target was obscured by clouds. The bombers dropped their loads by radar and dead reckoning, unable to see the ground. Anti-aircraft fire was intense, but inaccurate in the poor visibility. No bombers were lost to enemy action. After bombing, the surviving bombers turned south to return to Libya. But now navigation became critical. The bomber crews had to fly south across the Mediterranean in darkness and bad weather, find the North African coast, and locate their home airfield. This required precise dead reckoning navigation using compass headings, airspeed, and estimated winds. Any error in calculation could result in the bomber missing the airfield and flying out into the desert. The Lady Be Good's navigator, Lieutenant Hayes, was responsible for guiding the bomber home. He had to calculate the return course, estimate wind drift, and direct the pilot to fly the correct heading. But Hayes was inexperienced. This was his first combat mission. He had trained in the United States, but had never navigated across featureless ocean in darkness and bad weather. The clouds prevented him from seeing stars for celestial navigation. He had no landmarks to use for visual reference. He had only his instruments, his calculations, and his judgment. And somewhere in the darkness over the Mediterranean, Hayes made a fatal error. The exact nature of the mistake will never be known with certainty, but the most likely explanation is that Hayes miscalculated the bomber's ground speed, failing to account for strong tailwinds pushing the aircraft faster than its indicated airspeed. This meant the Lady Be Good reached the African coast sooner than Hayes calculated. When Hayes believed the bomber was still over the Mediterranean approaching the coast, it had already crossed the coast and was flying south into the Sahara Desert. At some point during the return flight, the Lady Be Good's radio operator, Sergeant Lamotte, attempted to contact Solik Airfield for a radio direction finding bearing. Radio direction finding allowed ground stations to determine an aircraft's position by triangulating radio signals. But Lamotte's radio calls went unanswered. The airfield's radio equipment may have been malfunctioning, or atmospheric conditions may have prevented communication. Whatever the reason, the Lady Be Good received no navigational assistance from ground stations. The crew was on their own, flying blind in darkness over what they believed was the Mediterranean Sea. The bomber's fuel gauges showed fuel running low. After more than 9 hours of flight, the tanks were nearly empty. The crew had no idea where they were. They believed they were over water, still trying to reach the African coast. In reality, they had crossed the coast hours earlier and were now 400 miles inland, deep in the Sahara. At approximately 0200 hours on April 5, 1943, Lieutenant Hatton made a fateful decision. With fuel exhausted and no landmarks visible in the darkness, he ordered the crew to bail out. The standard procedure when a bomber was lost over water with no fuel was for the crew to parachute out, hoping to land near shore or be rescued from the sea. Hatton believed his aircraft was over the Mediterranean, probably close to the coast. He ordered the crew to put on their parachutes and prepare to jump. The crew followed orders without question. They grabbed their emergency supplies, canteens, first aid kits, survival gear, and moved to the bomb bay and waist gun positions where they could exit the aircraft. One by one, the 9 men jumped into the darkness, expecting to land in the Mediterranean Sea. They had no idea they were actually 400 miles inland, about to parachute into one of the most inhospitable deserts on Earth. After the crew bailed out, the Lady Be Good continued flying south on autopilot. The bomber, now crewless, flew on through the night with no one aboard. The engines continued running, consuming the last drops of fuel. Eventually, fuel exhaustion caused the engines to stop. The bomber descended gradually, still under the control of the autopilot and the natural aerodynamic stability of the aircraft. At some point, the Lady Be Good made a wheels-up landing on flat desert sand. The impact was relatively gentle. The bomber skidded across the sand and came to rest essentially intact. The aircraft sat there, abandoned in the desert, 400 miles from the nearest human habitation. It would remain there, undiscovered, for 16 years. The 9 crewmen parachuted into the darkness, expecting to land in water. Instead, they landed on sand. The shock must have been profound. They found themselves in complete darkness in the middle of a desert, with no idea where they were or how far from safety. As dawn broke on April 5th, the crew gathered together and assessed their situation. They were alive and mostly uninjured, though some had sustained minor injuries during the parachute landing. They had their flight suits, their parachutes, and whatever emergency supplies they had grabbed before jumping. They had limited water, perhaps a few canteens. They had no food except for emergency rations. They had no radio. They had no map of the desert. And they had no idea which direction to walk to reach civilization. Lieutenant Toner, the co-pilot, began keeping a diary. The diary, written in pencil on pages torn from a notebook, would later be found with his body, and would provide the only first-hand account of the crew's ordeal. The diary's first entry, dated April 5th, reads, Naples, 28 planes. Things pretty well mixed up. Got lost returning. Out of gas. Jumped. Landed in desert at 2 o'clock in morning. No one hurt. Can't find John, Warpath. All others present. The crew had landed scattered across several miles of desert. 8 of the 9 men found each other. Lieutenant Warpath, the bombardier, was missing. They searched for him, but could not find him in the vast emptiness. They had no choice but to move on. They believed they were somewhere south of their base, and that if they walked north, they would eventually reach the coast and civilization. They were partially correct. The coast was north, but it was over 400 miles away. The crew began walking north on the morning of April 5th. They had no compass, so they used the sun to maintain a northward direction. They walked during the day, which was a mistake. Walking in the Sahara during daylight exposes travelers to brutal heat and causes rapid dehydration. They should have rested during the day and walked at night, but they didn't know this. They were airmen, not desert survival experts. They walked across flat gravel desert, hoping to see signs of civilization, a road, a well, a village, anything. But there was nothing. The Libyan Desert in this region is one of the emptiest places on Earth. Hundreds of miles of flat gravel and sand with no water, no vegetation, no life. The crew was walking through a dead zone where no human had any reason to be. Toner's diary entries over the next few days document the crew's deteriorating condition. April 6th. Still heading north. Sun very hot. No one feels very well. A few rations, 1 to 2 canteen of water left. April 7th. Still going north. Very little water. Nights very cold. No sleep. Rested and walked. The crew was suffering from dehydration, heat exhaustion, and cold at night. Desert temperatures in April can reach 40 degrees Celsius during the day and drop near freezing at night. The men had only their flight suits for protection. They had no shelter. They had almost no water. Dehydration was killing them. April 8th, Toner's diary. Hit sand dunes, still going north. Sun very hot, no water. Aching all over, still all together. Prayers all the time. Again, no sleep. The crew had reached the sand dunes of the Calancio Sand Sea, a vast region of shifting dunes that blocked their path north. Walking through sand dunes requires enormous physical effort and accelerates dehydration. The crew was weakening rapidly. They were running on willpower alone. April 9th. Still NW, but man, is everyone weak. Can't get very far. Prayers all the time. Again, Our Father, which art in heaven, and Sergeant Shelley leads the prayer for help. Some of the fellows hallucinating. Shelley, Rip, Moore, Lamotte, and myself have sore feet. Others give out too. On April 10th, 5 days after parachuting into the desert, the crew's cohesion began breaking down. The stronger members decided to push ahead, hoping to find water and send back help. The weaker members could not keep up and had to be left behind. This must have been an agonizing decision, but there was no alternative. Carrying the weaker men would have killed everyone. Toner's diary entry for April 10th. Hit sand dunes again, getting weaker all the time, the rest all very weak. 4 of the fellows ahead about 1-2 mile, can hardly get along. April 11th. Shelley, Rip, and Moore separate and try to go for help. Rest of us all very weak. Eyes bad. Not any travel for rest of us. The diary ends there. Toner's final entry was April 11th, 7 days after the crew parachuted into the desert. The stronger men, Shelley, Ripslinger, and Moore, had gone ahead to find help. The remaining men, Toner, Hatton, Hayes, Lamotte, and Adams, were too weak to continue. They presumably died over the next day or two from dehydration and exposure. Toner's body would later be found with the diary still in his pocket. The diary's final pages were blank. Toner had nothing more to write. Staff Sergeant Guy Shelley, Technical Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, and Staff Sergeant Vernon Moore, the 3 men who pushed ahead, managed to walk farther than the others. Shelley's body would later be found approximately 26 miles north of where Toner died. Ripslinger's body was found approximately 44 miles north. Moore's body was found approximately 78 miles north. These men walked incredible distances while dying of dehydration. They walked until their bodies gave out. And most incredibly, one crewman, whose identity has never been definitively established, but was probably Sergeant Moore, walked over 100 miles from where the crew first landed. Footprints and body position suggest this man walked farther north than any other crewman, collapsing and dying alone in the desert after walking a distance that defies comprehension for a man without water in the Sahara. Lieutenant John Warpath, the bombardier who had been separated from the crew during the parachute landing, walked in a different direction. He apparently landed farther west than the others and walked northwest rather than north. His body was not found until 1960, 17 years after his death, approximately 12 miles from where the main group landed. He had died alone, probably within days of landing, unable to find the other crewmen. 9 men parachuted into the desert. All 9 died of dehydration within approximately 8 days. None of them came close to reaching civilization. They died in one of the most remote regions of the Sahara, and their bodies lay there for years, mummified by the dry air, waiting to be found. The discovery of the Lady B. Good wreck in 1959 sparked an intensive search for the crew's remains. Now that the aircraft had been located, searchers knew approximately where to look for the bodies. The first bodies were found in 1960. Searchers working outward from the wreck site found 5 bodies within a year: Warpath, Toner, Hatton, Hayes, and Adams. The bodies were remarkably well preserved, mummified by the desert's dry conditions. Personal effects, including Toner's diary, were recovered. The bodies were identified through dental records and dog tags and were returned to the United States for burial with full military honors. The families, who had waited 17 years without knowing what happened to their loved ones, finally had answers and could properly mourn. But 3 bodies remained missing. Shelley, Ripslinger, and Moore, the 3 men who had walked ahead to find help, had not been located. Search teams continued looking, expanding their search radius outward from the wreck site. In 1960, Shelley's body was found. In 1961, Ripslinger's body was found. But Moore's body remained missing. Search efforts continued sporadically over the decades. In 1969, a British Army team found what they believed were Moore's remains approximately 78 miles north of the wreck site. But identification was uncertain. It was not until 1995, 52 years after the crew died, that the last body was conclusively identified as belonging to one of the Lady B. Good crew. By that time, most of the crew's families had passed away. The men's parents, who had prayed for decades that their sons might somehow still be alive, were gone. But the military does not forget. The bodies were returned to the United States and buried with honors. All 9 crewmen of the Lady B. Good were finally accounted for. The Lady B. Good herself remained in the desert for several years after her discovery. The aircraft became a site of pilgrimage for aviation enthusiasts and historians. The Libyan government, which controlled the territory, allowed limited access to the wreck site. In the 1960s, the U.S. Air Force conducted studies of the aircraft to understand how well equipment had survived 16 years of desert exposure. They found that many components were still functional, or could be made functional with minimal maintenance. The engines, when provided with fresh fuel and oil, actually ran. The radio equipment, though corroded, could be repaired. The aircraft's structure was sound except where sand abrasion had weakened the aluminum skin. The Lady B. Good demonstrated that aircraft can survive for decades in desert conditions with minimal deterioration, a finding that influenced later decisions about aircraft storage and preservation. Eventually, portions of the Lady Be Good were recovered and distributed to museums. The nose section, with the Lady Be Good name painted on it, was recovered and is now displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Other components went to various military and aviation museums. The remaining wreckage was left in the desert, where it gradually deteriorated over subsequent decades. By the 1980s, little remained of the aircraft at the original crash site. Sand had buried much of the wreckage. Souvenir hunters had removed accessible parts. The Lady Be Good, which had miraculously survived 16 years intact, was finally consumed by the desert. The story of the Lady Be Good raises profound questions about navigation, decision-making, and the randomness of survival in war. The crew's fate was determined by a navigation error, a miscalculation of winds or ground speed that caused them to overshoot their base by hundreds of miles. This was an easy mistake to make given the technology and conditions of 1943. Navigation in bad weather over featureless terrain was extraordinarily difficult. Many bomber crews made similar mistakes and died as a result. The Lady Be Good crew was unlucky. If they had overshot their base by 50 miles instead of 400, they would have realized their error when they crossed the coast, turned back, and landed safely. If the radio direction finding equipment at Solik Airfield had been working, the crew could have gotten a bearing and corrected their course. If the weather had been clear, the navigator could have used stars or landmarks to determine position. Any one of a dozen small differences might have saved them. The decision to bail out was reasonable given the information the crew had. Lieutenant Hatton believed his aircraft was over water, fuel was exhausted, and continuing to fly was pointless. Bailing out seemed like the best chance of survival. He had no way of knowing he was actually over land. If he had known, he would presumably have attempted to land the aircraft. A wheels-up landing in the desert, as the unmanned Lady Be Good later demonstrated, was survivable. The crew could have stayed with the aircraft, which had shelter, supplies, and better visibility for search planes. But Hatton didn't know. He made the best decision he could with the information available. It turned out to be the wrong decision, but that was not his fault. The crew's survival efforts after landing were heroic, but ultimately futile. Walking 400 miles across the Sahara without water is impossible. The human body cannot survive more than 3 to 5 days without water in desert conditions. The Lady Be Good crew survived 8 days, an extraordinary testament to their physical conditioning and willpower, but they never had a realistic chance of reaching safety. If they had stayed at the parachute landing site and built signal fires or markers visible from the air, search planes might have found them. But the crew didn't know search planes were looking primarily over the Mediterranean. They believed they were only a short distance from civilization and that walking north was their best option. Again, it was a reasonable decision based on incomplete information that turned out to be wrong. The search efforts after the Lady Be Good failed to return raised questions about how such searches were conducted. Allied forces in North Africa had no reason to search hundreds of miles inland in the Sahara. The crew had been flying over the Mediterranean. The assumption was that if the bomber went down, it went down in the sea. Search aircraft flew patterns over the Mediterranean looking for wreckage or survivors in the water. No one thought to search deep inland. The bomber had simply vanished. Eventually, after weeks of fruitless searching, the crew was declared missing in action, presumed dead. The families received telegrams informing them of the loss. And for 16 years, that was the end of the story. The families mourned. The military moved on to other operations. The Lady Be Good and her crew were forgotten. The discovery in 1959 changed that. Suddenly, the families had answers. They learned that their loved ones had survived the flight, had parachuted safely, and had tried desperately to walk to safety. They learned about Toner's diary and the crew's prayers and their efforts to help each other. They learned that the men had not died in combat or in a crash, but slowly, of thirst, in the desert. For some families, this knowledge brought closure. For others, it brought new pain. Knowing that the men had suffered for days before dying was harder than believing they had died instantly in a crash. But at least the families knew the truth. The Lady Be Good story has been told in numerous books, documentaries, and articles. The most comprehensive account is Lady Be Good, Mystery Bomber of World War II by Dennis E. McClendon, published in 1962. The book included extensive excerpts from Toner's diary and interviews with search team members who found the wreck and bodies. A television documentary was produced in 1970 by the BBC. More recent documentaries have used modern forensic techniques to analyze the crew's remains and equipment, providing additional details about their final days. The story has become one of the most famous unsolved mysteries of World War II. Not because of any great strategic importance. The loss of one bomber and 9 men was sadly routine in that war, but because of the haunting image of the ghost bomber sitting intact in the desert for 16 years, while the crew's bodies lay scattered across the sand. The technical aspects of how the Lady Be Good could fly 400 miles without a crew and land itself relatively intact have fascinated aviation experts. The B-24's autopilot was a simple mechanical device that could maintain altitude and heading but could not land an aircraft. The Lady Be Good's landing was purely the result of aerodynamic stability and luck. As the bomber ran out of fuel and the engine stopped, the aircraft descended gradually. The flat desert provided an ideal landing surface. No obstacles, no vegetation, relatively firm sand. The bomber came down on its belly, skidded across the sand, absorbing energy, and stopped. It was an almost perfect emergency landing, accomplished entirely by physics and chance, with no human input. This demonstrates the inherent stability of aircraft design. A well-designed aircraft like the B-24 will tend to maintain level flight and descend gradually even without power or pilot input, giving it a chance of surviving an emergency landing if the terrain is favorable. The preservation of equipment after 16 years in the desert surprised researchers. Desert conditions are generally favorable for preserving artifacts because there is no moisture to cause rust or biological decay. But 16 years of exposure to sun, wind, sand, and extreme temperature variations should have destroyed electronics and degraded metal and rubber components. Instead, the Lady Be Good's equipment remained largely functional. This led to research into desert storage of military equipment. The U.S. military now maintains boneyards in desert locations like Arizona, where thousands of retired aircraft are stored in conditions similar to where the Lady Be Good was found. These aircraft can remain in storage for decades and potentially be returned to service if needed. The Lady Be Good proved that this approach works. The fate of the Lady Be Good crew has been compared to other famous desert survival stories, such as that of the Saint-Exupéry crew who crashed in the Sahara in 1935 and survived by walking to civilization. But those men had crashed relatively close to a caravan route and were lucky to encounter Bedouins who helped them. The Lady Be Good crew was in a much more remote location, hundreds of miles from any human habitation or traveled routes. They had no chance of encountering anyone who could help. They were entirely on their own, and the desert gave them no mercy. The psychological experience of the crew during their 8-day ordeal can only be imagined. Toner's diary entries suggest that the men maintained discipline and stayed together as a unit as long as possible. They prayed together. They helped each other. They made collective decisions about which direction to walk. As they weakened and began to die, The stronger men pushed ahead to find help, while the weaker stayed behind. This suggests that military training and unit cohesion remained intact even in extremis. The crew did not panic, did not turn on each other, did not descend into chaos. They acted as soldiers, doing their duty and trying to survive. That they failed was not due to any lack of courage or effort. They simply faced a situation that was unsurvivable without water. The question of whether the Lady Be Good crew could have been saved if they had been found sooner is unanswerable. If search aircraft had somehow located the bomber in the first few days after the crew bailed out, and if they had realized the bomber was inland rather than over the sea, and if they had searched the surrounding desert, they might have found some of the crew alive. But all of these things had to happen, and none of them did. The search focused on the Mediterranean. By the time anyone would have thought to search inland, the crew was already dead. The timeline was too short. The desert killed them faster than search efforts could locate them. The legacy of the Lady Be Good extends beyond the specific story of this one bomber and crew. The story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of navigation errors and the unforgiving nature of the desert. It is taught at U.S. Air Force survival schools as an example of what not to do when lost in hostile terrain. It has influenced search and rescue procedures, emphasizing the importance of considering all possibilities when an aircraft goes missing, not just the most obvious ones. It has contributed to understanding of desert survival and the limits of human endurance without water, and it has provided closure for the families of the crew, who at least know what happened to their loved ones, even if the knowledge is painful. The graves of the Lady Be Good crew are scattered across the United States, in the hometowns where the men grew up. Each grave bears a marker noting the man's rank, unit, and date of death. April 5, 1943. Though most did not actually die until days later, the military lists their death date as when they went missing. Some families held memorial services when the men were initially listed as missing. Later, when the bodies were recovered, proper burial services were held. The men were honored as heroes who died in service to their country. They received military funerals with full honors. Their names are included on memorials to fallen airmen. They are remembered. In 2009, the U.S. Air Force held a ceremony at the National Museum of the United States Air Force commemorating the 66th anniversary of the Lady Be Good crew's death. Veterans, historians, and descendants of the crew attended. The nose section of the Lady Be Good was rededicated as a memorial. Speakers honored the crew's sacrifice and spoke about the importance of remembering those who served. It was a reminder that even decades later, even for men who died in obscurity in a remote desert, the military and the nation remember and honor their service. The story of the Lady Be Good is ultimately a tragedy, but it is also a story of courage, endurance, and brotherhood. 9 men parachuted into the desert, believing they would land in water and be rescued. Instead, they found themselves in hell. They could have given up immediately. They could have sat down and waited to die. Instead, they walked. They tried to save themselves and each other. They prayed together. They helped the weakest among them. They pushed forward until their bodies could not go any farther. They did not give up. They died trying. That is worthy of honor and remembrance. The Sahara Desert has killed countless people over millennia. It is one of the harshest environments on Earth, a place where humans have no business being without extensive preparation and equipment. The Lady Be Good crew had neither. They had flight suits, a few canteens, and their training. It was not enough. The desert killed them as it has killed so many others. But their story survived. Their remains were found. Their fate was discovered. And because of that, they are remembered. The desert did not erase them. They are not forgotten. Their names are known. Their service is honored. And the Lady Be Good, the ghost bomber that flew itself 400 miles and landed itself in the sand, has become one of the most famous aircraft in aviation history, a memorial to the 9 men who died trying to come home.